Microsoft to lay off 10,000 workers, about 5% of its workforce, despite recent claims of a labor shortage and rising prices. What does it mean for you? What does it mean when companies like Microsoft continually claim that there's a terrible shortage of qualified workers and yet are constantly laying off those workers? Microsoft to lay off 10,000 workers as tech cuts add up. Microsoft has joined a large list of big name and less well known high tech companies that in the last few months have laid off or claim to have laid off many, many tens of thousands of workers. This despite a long history of Microsoft claiming a desperate shortage of qualified programmers and other workers. Here's from a few years ago a program with community colleges to train people for cybersecurity, supposedly. But here, many hits through Google of Microsoft presidency's new era of stagnating labor, July of 2022, about 6 months ago. This was a heavily covered presentation. Here we go, Microsoft President Brad Smith talking to Reuters here. U.S. companies are facing a new era in which fewer people are entering the workforce and pressure to pay higher salaries may become permanent, Microsoft's president Brad Smith told Reuters in an interview. And it goes on in this general vein. This is not new. Microsoft has a long history of claiming desperate shortages of science, technology, engineering, and mathematic workers, primarily meaning programmers, but also other types of workers, and yet at the same time laying off large numbers of employees. Here's Bill Gates testifying to the House Committee on Science and Technology in 2008. I know we all want the U.S. to continue to be the world center for innovation, but our position is at risk. There are many reasons for this, but two stand out. First, U.S. companies face a severe shortfall of scientists and engineers with expertise to develop the next generation of breakthroughs. Second, we don't invest enough as a nation in basic research needed to drive long-term innovation. And here we have a number of layoffs. One of the most remarkable took place in 2014 when Microsoft laid off many employees. Here we say 18,000. Most of the employees, about 12,500, were the Nokia phone division, many in Finland, which is ranked as one of the best education systems for math and science in the world. At exactly the same time that Microsoft was laying off these 18,000 difficult to find STEM workers. So these are real experts in Finland, supposedly very hard to find. They didn't retrain them. They didn't assign them to a new project, do anything like that. They just laid them off. And the New York Times, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, and Sheldon Adelson, who's since passed away, under their name anyway, had this op-ed called Break the Immigration Impasse, calling for so-called immigration reform, meaning more immigrants on dicey guest worker visas, such as the controversial H-1B visa, which is actually a non-immigrant visa, incidentally. What they said is, we believe it borders on insanity to train intelligent and motivated people in our universities, often subsidizing their education, and then to deport them when they graduate. Many of these people, of course, want to return to their home country, and that's fine. But for those who wish to stay and work in computer science or technology fields badly in need of their services, let's roll out the welcome mat. A talented graduate reform was included in a bill that the Senate approved last year by a 68-32 vote. It would remove the worldwide cap on the number of visas that could be awarded to legal immigrants who'd earned a graduate degree in science, technology, engineering, or mathematics from an accredited institution of higher education in the United States, provided they had an offer of employment. The bill also included a sensible plan that would have allowed illegal residents to obtain citizenship, though only after they'd earned the right to do so. by working at low wages for several years. One is reminded of the definition of chutzpah as that quality enshrined in a man who, having killed his mother and father, throws himself on the mercy of the court because he's an orphan. And here we have more layoffs and more layoffs. For many years, Microsoft and many other high-tech companies employed a policy called stack and rank, supposedly laying off every year the lower 5 or 10% of their workers, which keep in mind, and so we have all these layoffs, we have continual sort of stealth layoffs through stack and rank and other methods. But keep in mind, it's extremely hard to get a job at Microsoft and many of these other companies like Google and Apple and so forth. Nowadays, people have to go through a grueling interview process that involves coding interviews if you're a programmer and other kinds of programs. So these are like often computer science 101 questions, how do you make a hash table, all these kind of things that actually most programmers never use in the real world. All of these things are built into the programming languages, C++, Python, all of these things. You never actually have to do these things in a coding interview. So in the actual coding, in actual programming in industry. Nonetheless, you get drilled on these questions, which tends to skew who gets the jobs to hardworking young people who just got out of school and had formal training in these unused techniques, or B, older people who have a lot of free time. So think about people who are single or people who don't have kids to worry about and other things, have the time to spend large amounts of time reading and practicing from these books or there's all sorts of courses now for people to prepare for these coding interviews. Just to give some idea, Cracking the Coding Interview by Gail Lockman McDowell, which is what I'm focusing on, is one of the most successful. It's a bestseller. It goes back many years. She's also got books on how to interview for being a program manager and marketing, I think, all kinds of stuff, right? Well, there's all sorts of these. Here we got Hacking the System Design Interview, Ace the Data Science Interview, Coding Interview. I'm not sure if this is probably not the Eric Schmidt from Google, that was the head of Google. But you can see there's tons of these. Why are there tons of these? Because they're very grueling, very demanding. And they routinely don't even bother to interview people with degrees from top universities, with excellent track records, particularly older, and older often means over 35 or even 30. Even though Microsoft and these other companies that are now laying off people claim to hire the best of the best, to pick the very top, the mythical 10x or 100x programmers are extremely hard to find. These mutant supermen, they're laying them off as we speak. So what does this mean for you? Well, if you're young and you're thinking about whether to go into programming, there's a number of questions you need to ask yourself as to how real the demand is. These companies are astonishingly picky in selecting employees. So it's one thing to perhaps borrow on student loans and that sort of thing, learn how to do all of this, and perhaps not even be able to find a job simply because the companies are very demanding. That's not the impression they give from many of their presentations, like those given historically by Bill Gates or by Brad Smith only 6 months ago, even as the massive wave of 2022 layoffs in other companies was starting, and now, of course, it has reached Microsoft. It's very clear, regardless of exactly how one interprets this behavior, that these perennial statements claiming terrible shortages and pressure on wages and so forth are at best grossly exaggerated and at worst completely bogus. So when you hear companies like Microsoft saying that there's a terrible shortage, they'll hire anyone who's qualified, whatever that means, remember these announcements, which are probably the tip of the iceberg. Companies like Microsoft are required to announce large layoffs due to state and federal regulations. Many of these companies seem to have stealth layoff methods like stack and rank that get rid of large numbers of, usually, whether by design or accident, older employees. And older is not like 50s even, which would be illegal if deliberately done. It is often people over 35 or even 30 in some cases. So take these not just with a grain of salt, but realize they've said this for years and years and years, and yet they keep laying off highly qualified workers or making them so uncomfortable they leave the companies. Now, should companies like Microsoft do this? I would say certainly not. It's probably very costly to the companies. But they believe it works. Without access to their internal accounting and other information that is proprietary, competitive, and sensitive, without really taking a hard look at these policies, which have been going on for decades, if not longer, it's hard to know for sure what they're really doing, how well justified it is. But what it does mean for people is jobs in high-tech companies like Microsoft are often, for many, many workers, very highly qualified workers, short-lived and unstable, something that doesn't turn up in in salary surveys and other information. So in conclusion, don't buy the hype. Realize that companies like Microsoft that claim year after year shortages, tight labor market, have a long history of laying off large numbers of employees.